Hey everyone, Benny Grotto from Mad Oak Studios in Boston, Massachusetts here with you today. Recently ordered a set of Samar MG33 microphones and I wanted to test them around a drum kit using some of my more familiar go-to microphones to compare against, and I wanted to share the results with you here. My A&F raw steel drum kit was set up in the live room from a session the day before, and so was a Black Galaxy Ludwig Acrolite snare drum. So I just decided to go with those as they were already set up in the room, and I am lazy. I also grabbed some really bright, really loud cymbals because I thought that might be a good way to sort of stress test the off-axis pickup to just kind of get a feel for how these mics would deal with spill, bleed, and just in general what they sound like from off-axis sources. To that end, for my hi-hats, I used an A on top and a super bright and loud Z Custom for the bottom hi-hat. And then for my ride cymbal, I had an A Custom Ping Ride. Again, these cymbals are really bright, really loud, and I was certainly hitting them kind of hard. It really gave me an opportunity to see how these different mics were going to compare in terms of their bleed. To start, I wanted to go for my go-to drum setup using primarily dynamic mics around the kit. So with that, I had a D12 VR on the kick drum, and a set of RN17s as overheads. Those actually remain unchanged for the entire session. And then for snare top and bottom, I did a couple 57s. And then on the toms, I did some Audio-Technica ATM 25s to start. Once I had all that stuff positioned in like the normal positions I go for, I grabbed the Samar MG33s and I positioned them as close as physically possible to the dynamic microphones. I also went ahead and recorded both raw and processed versions of these sounds. I don't generally record flat when I'm doing real sessions, so it didn't seem like an entirely prudent thing to do it here, as I'm kind of curious about how the mics perform when processed. But there's also a lot of value, I think, in hearing what the raw signals sound like off of each microphone and being able to compare really just kind of the raw direct captures. Positioning was really easy. These mics are very small. In fact, you can see this tiny little thing right here is the mic in question, and I'm using it to record dialogue. I hope it sounds cool. I actually haven't used it on voice yet. This will be my first time trying that, but you can see it's really small. I got some pictures that I'll share here that give you a sense of scale as well. So because these things are really small, they're super lightweight. They're very, very easy to put way at the end of a boom in all kinds of positions around a drum kit with very minimal hassle, relatively speaking. After I went through and made a bunch of recordings with those ATM 25s on the toms, I decided to swap the ATM 25s for Sennheiser 421s. I don't actually use 421s myself very often on toms, but I figure they're such a popular choice that it would probably make sense to just see how the Samar microphones compare to them on toms, just to kind of get like a more complete picture of what's going on. I've also included a full kit blend, which will be, as the name suggests, a full kit with the kick and the overheads, so you can hear everything in context. And then another set of tracks where the overheads and kick mics are muted, so you're just hearing the Samar microphones versus their dynamic mic competition. Just a couple quick notes. When I first set everything up, I was working by myself. Didn't have an assistant, so I was running back and forth between control room and live room, and frankly didn't take enough time to get everything positioned optimally. So the overheads ended up being a couple, 2-3 feet maybe lower than is ideal. I did eventually raise them, and I'll make a note of that when I play you the when we get to that audio. But for these first couple samples, the overhead placement is not totally optimized. The other issue I came across after experimenting a bit with these mics is that the MG33s have a fairly pronounced proximity effect. And so in the initial tests, when I was using some of my go-to microphones in what would be a typical starting position for me using those mics, when I matched the positioning with the MG33s, I was unknowingly putting the mics maybe a little closer than I should have been for kind of what would be a optimal tom recording in particular. It wasn't so bad with the snare drum, but I found it a little bit problematic on the toms. And eventually I got wise and I pulled the mics back a little bit, and it improved the tom sound, I think, pretty dramatically. So, of course, there will be audio examples of that as well. Okay, so this next batch of audio to share is basically the same approach. D12VR still on the kick drum. The RN17s are still on the overheads, but I have swapped out the dynamic mics on the shells for some condensers. I tend to favor condensers in general on a drum kit, so this is a little bit more close to home for me. In this case, I was using a Sontronics DM1S microphone on the snare top, and then a very lovely vintage brass capsule 414 EB for snare bottom. And then I had a couple of CAD 179s on the toms. The next bit of audio here is probably going to be one of the first questions that a lot of people have when they see these MG33s. They look like little tiny baby Josephson E22Ss, and I'm sure a lot of people are wondering how these things might compare. So I went ahead and made some A/B recordings of the Samar against the Josephson. These are all unprocessed, just straight off the mics to kind of hear what all the mics are doing. The next audio clip here for you is kind of a tweaked setup. At this point, I'd kind of figured out the proximity effect of the MG33s, and instead of just trying to kind of directly A/B a bunch of different mics, I thought, why don't I actually try to get a good drum sound? Novel concept. So I raised the overheads a little bit, got what I think is a better position for them in the room. I fussed around a little bit with the snare mic positioning to kind of fine tune that a little bit. And then I backed the tom mics off, which, as I said, helped a lot in terms of how they were kind of hearing the low end. I also kind of started wondering about how this mic might perform on different snare drums. And in particular, I was starting to get curious about the microphone's SPL handling. It does something like 140 something dB, which is a pretty good amount, but not as much as, say, an SM57 or any other typical dynamic mic. So I wanted to see if I went for just kind of pure volume, how would this thing react? And so I grabbed a Gretsch hand-hammered chrome over brass snare that's screaming loud. So it's a really good drum for testing SPL handling. I also want to just mention I left all of the processing on in this case. I didn't bother with a flat recording because, I don't know, it was boring to me. I figured out what I needed to figure out in the previous batch of recordings in terms of like how the raw mic signals sound, and I got interested in how these things might sound, in context and how I might actually use them on a real recording session. And now, just to kind of bring it back to this question about proximity effect that I was so clearly struggling with the other day, I made a set of tom recordings with the Samars, backed up a little bit off the drum to kind of minimize that proximity effect a little bit. This will be both without and with some processing. So if anyone gives a damn, my closing thoughts about these things are that they sound really darn good on a drum kit. Haven't yet tested them on any instruments. I'm testing it right now on my voice. I will see how that sounds when I press stop on the Pro Tools here and listen back to the audio. I hope it's good. But on a drum kit, these things work great. I think that they outperformed everything on snare top for me by a pretty wide margin. I really like them a lot on snare top. On snare bottom, I think the 414 still beats them out. There's just something magical about that microphone, but by a slim margin, and I certainly preferred the Samar to the 57. Another advantage about the Samar microphone in this case, though, might be the ease of positioning on a really busy drum kit. Sometimes the 414 is a little cumbersome to get underneath the snare drum. On toms, I would say these things beat the dynamic mics handily. That's no surprise for me. At least me personally, I tend to really like condensers on toms and pretty much always find that they outperform their dynamic relatives. In terms of how they compared to the 179, I would say on par. It's a slightly different flavor. The direct pickup was quite good on both microphones, where the MG33 edges out the 179 for me in this case was in the off-axis pickup. The CAD 179s can sometimes sound a little trashy in the off-axis pickup. They might chalk that up to superior mic design in general, or it could be just a function of small diaphragm condenser versus large diaphragm condenser, what have you. Don't really know. I would add that given the ease of placement with these mics, it's another way to sort of optimize their position in ways that you can't always quite get optimized with the CAD 179s. In comparing the MG33 to the Josephson E22S, man, those E22Ss sound really good on the toms. I think the bottom end of the Josephson just a little tighter, a little punchier, a little bit more flattering to a tom. But once again, in terms of the off-axis pickup, I preferred the sound of the bleed in the MG33. So that's a kind of a decision where you got to weigh those two things against one another. If it was a minimal kit, Josephson might win out. If it was a maximal kit, big metal kit with a lot of cymbals or something like that, the Samars end up looking real good in a situation like that. As easy as the Josephsons are to position on a drum kit, these things are even easier because they are smaller and weigh considerably less. So pretty good showing against one of the staples of modern drum recording, and for like a quarter of the price or maybe a third of the price, which is sort of a nice bonus as well. Last couple thoughts. If you're looking at my Pro Tools session here, I mean, you can see I did a lot of recording and I'm only sharing a relatively small fraction of what I recorded. Much of this was just me trying to answer questions that I had about the microphones and how they perform. Might not really be particularly interesting or worth sharing here. But I will say, as just anyone who's wondering about how these things perform as spot mics on cymbals, I did try it. I didn't like it. They didn't sound bad by any means, but they didn't bring anything new or compelling to the table. So for me, they didn't do anything that other mics in my collection didn't do as well or better. So as cymbal spot mics, whatever. All right, so I hope to get around to testing these things a bit on some other instruments, not just on drums. I suspect they'll be quite good at things like acoustic guitars and maybe mandolins and other instruments along those lines. I do have a request from an internet friend to try these things on strings, so hopefully I can get that together, and maybe I'll even make a video of it. I don't know. If so, I guess check back here at some point if you are so inclined to see if any additional sound files about these things have been shared. Until then, happy trails.